want to welcome everybody here. It just so happens that we arrived in Medellín, Colombia last night, and you can see in our background, we have the city behind us, which is actually good timing because we are going to talk about some of the work we're doing here. And then a year later, after we published a book, which came after years of research in the field. So I am the program director. I'm also professor of practice in the program. And I just wanted Joan to have a chance to introduce himself, and then we'll get started into more of the content.
Thank you, Dom, and welcome everyone. So I'm Joan Camilo Lopez, and I am the program manager of the Youth Peace and Security program at AC4 and an adjunct faculty at the NECR program.
Great, thank you. So AC4 is a consortium that we have at the university. So in addition to the NECR program, we're part of a much larger and richer community of people working in the field in some way of conflict resolution, peace building, sustainability, and so on. So we talk about a scholar practitioner model at the School of Professional Studies, in the negotiation program at AC4, and so on. And what does that really mean? It really means that if we think of it on a continuum with scholarship and heavy research on one end and super applied practice on the other end, we can be anywhere on that continuum. And it means that we understand theory and we use theory and scholarship to inform our practice, and then we experience things in the field that we understand through theory. And so we will talk today about where we are with our work in the field here in Medellín, Colombia, that we do believe is applicable globally. Actually, we'll talk about that too. And you'll get to see how we try to integrate, I don't know if it's balanced, but integrate theory and practice, and how we involve students in the work as well. We'll have a chance to highlight that. And our work, or our sort of a framing of the work that we're doing, is extremely participatory. And part of our thinking about being here in the field is not to come in from academia and tell people what to do, but it's really to say, what is going on here that's already working well, and how can we add value? How can we already enhance what's taking place? And so we started to find little niches for our work and our effectiveness, and that's why we have several years, I guess 5, 6, 7 years of working with particular organizations and new organizations in different groups all the time. And this is something that culminated in the book, which we'll talk about a little bit afterwards too, and show you a visual. We do believe very much in experiential work, so it's not just sitting in a room and philosophizing or theorizing about what's happening, but it's actually being on the ground in the field and seeing it. There's something special about being on the ground that you can't get fully. And we will talk a little bit about virtual work as well. So during this pandemic, and even in general, because we don't live here in Colombia, and also when you're working with communities that have conflict and violence, you can't always be there. So there really is a necessity to be able to work effectively virtually. We do have a chapter of that in the book. And in this past pandemic year and a half or so, I mean, it's been almost 2 years since I've been back here because of the pandemic. Then we've had to figure out, how do you maintain relationships? How do you continue and advance the work that you're doing together, even working virtually? We really wanted to highlight and include the voices of our partners, and that comes out very much in the book, and it's coming out in the work we're doing afterwards. We'll talk about the workshops we're designing, and it's all about advancing learning, and learning for us that we can then spread the word, because that's part of what we're able to do being at Columbia University, is amplify the voices of others. So we're able to do that and learn. And then of course, people on the ground learn with us as well. So now Joan will give you a little bit of information about the book and where we are now.
So as Beth was saying, the approach that we have taken throughout these years working here in Medellín is participatory. And thus we wanted the book to represent this mode of addressing the issues that we work here in Medellín. And so we invited a group of our colleagues that have worked with us for years to co-author some of these chapters that you see here, that are in a way a culmination of a stage in the process that we have been developing here. So there you see some of the chapters. They really cover an ample ample areas, from developing self-awareness to grasping the context, to monitoring and evaluation, which has become very, very important for us lately. And then the role of the arts in transforming communities, which has been present here and elsewhere, especially in grassroots organizations. Then something that has become, or something that we have seen that is a challenge for many organizations on the ground, which is sustaining the change. How is it that you enact a program, an initiative, set it in motion, resolve or transform some issues, but then how do you sustain such transformation? And then actually, as we were writing the book, the pandemic hits, and then we had to think about how to think about working from a distance. And then, of course, at the end, we offer some sort of a guide that allows the readers of the book to prepare their own roadmap when they're, of course, thinking about working on the field. And that's the cover of the book. So I want to offer some background to the book. So as Beth already mentioned in passing, this book seeks to translate some of the successful fieldwork approaches to peace building into practical workshops, into practical approaches. So using theory that we of course use in the academia is important on the ground, but there are also practices on the ground that have emerged organically, if you will. And if you sort of merge them together, craft them together, we speak a lot about the craftsmanship that goes behind peace building and social transformation, then they become not only theoretical, methodological, but also very practical. So the book seeks to sort of explain this in a way that makes sense and that might be also applicable to different settings that have similar characteristics. So it draws from 7 years of working in violent conflict areas, namely in Medellín, Colombia, and especially among youth community leaders that in their work respond peacefully to such conflicts. So that's important. And the book wants to bridge the gap, the academic approaches to peace building with the grassroots approaches to social transformation. Right? And this is where we believe that our work becomes more important. So as we have been mentioning, this method, this approach is culturally and historically based in Medellín, in Colombia, which has particular characteristics. But we think that it can be utilized in other places of the world with characteristics that are similar in terms of forced displacement, in terms of the presence of youth, etc., etc. Right? So there is a craft and an art to peace building, and some of our work also draws from our reading of Lederach, for example, that speaks about art and the art, especially in the craft of peace building, in which you have to sort of be creative, methodological, of course, in order to make theory sort of live in the realities of societies. And this requires, and here we quote Lewin, a symphony of various sciences, right? So we apply sociology, communication, anthropology, history, conflict resolution, of course, and transformation as a way then to come up with the best possible approaches to transformation. And something central here is that we work with empirical experts, so people on the ground that for years have been designing and being creative about how to respond to these conflicts. So again, the approach is participatory in nature, very, very important, and we wanted the book to represent this. And as I mentioned before, some people with whom we have been working co-author some of these chapters.
So our intention from the very beginning is always to amplify what we discover and what we co-create with our partners on the ground. So the book is one manifestation of that creation. And even when we were writing the book, it was always our intention to then develop workshops so that we could deliver these workshops with our partners, co-facilitating with us, or maybe just doing all the facilitation, and developing other youth community leaders so that they could learn some of the approaches that we've been using collectively, and also they can integrate that into their own work or take on their own work and so on. So that was always our intention. And so now this is what we have been doing. We have been thinking about and actually acting on developing these workshops. So one is to really think about what we did this past summer. So in the summers, we tend to have fieldwork practicum. And when we were able to travel internationally, we did. And during the pandemic, we couldn't, but that doesn't mean we couldn't do it. We just did it virtually. So this past summer, we had a Peacebuilding course. We were able to do it virtually over Zoom to work with some of our partners on the ground. And students in the course started to design some of the modules of some of the chapters in the book. We left it up to them to see which chapters they wanted to pick and which modules inside of that, because we are trying to have workshop modules based on each of the chapters in the book, which we think has a nice flow about developing self-awareness, as Joan mentioned, and really it's about self as instrument. So your instrument of change, so as soon as you enter into any kind of a situation, the change can only be as well developed as you are in yourself to understand the impact you have on others. So we're doing that. And then we're continuing with that work. We've hired some students to work with us. So then they're getting the opportunity to take some of the practices that are in the book to work with our partners on the ground to develop or co-develop modules for the workshop. So if you can just go to the next slide. Okay, here you can see from two of the groups from this past summer, different sections about their presentations, about what they were able to do and what they might recommend, which we're going to integrate into a series of modules. So the goal is to have the workshops represent all of the chapters of the book. We have to think about, we still haven't quite finalized how long the series of workshops would be. Also, another intention is to have the book written in Spanish. So we're in the process of translating that book, and these workshops as well will be developed in Spanish too, so that because we have a very large population of Spanish-speaking people who I think would really want to participate in these workshops as well. And as I mentioned earlier, this is applicable all around the world because you have tremendous populations of youth in Africa, in Europe, in the Middle East, here in Latin America, in Asia, who are making or taking initiatives to really make a difference in their community. They're not necessarily waiting for government or politicians to make a difference, but they're saying, you know what, we want a better quality of life. We want to have a voice in what we're doing. And so in a variety of ways, they're doing it. And so part of what we do, being from the academy is, and really centered on learning, is being able to take these different things that we are learning from different people and then share it more broadly. And that's the purpose of the book and the workshops, because we'd love to have a global network of youth leaders who work together, learn from each other, and feed off of each other. Because even though contextually there are differences in different cultures and situations, there's also a lot of commonality that goes across where there can be universal learning there. So we're very interested in doing all of that and continuing to work with our partners. So another aspect of what we're doing in this follow-up year is starting to really understand the methodology that the groups we're working with are using, and what we can offer from our own experience in the field and in the academy is we can help offer a structure to their methodology. So it's their initiative, their unique, innovative approaches, and we're enhancing it by sort of helping to organize it all towards sustainability. One of the challenges that a lot of youth groups need in their field is that they have a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of ambition to want to do these different initiatives, but it's hard to sustain what they're doing because they don't have the structure, they don't know how to repeat necessarily into different ways to grow what they're doing. They sometimes have to get distracted by work, right? They may need to have a job that is different from the work that they're doing because they need to support themselves and their families. And so part of what we're doing then is also helping them become more visibly eligible for grant writing and other kinds of proposals to be funded funders want to see things expressed and written in certain ways that they can feel confident that their investment is going to be replicated and grow, and that it's not going to be into a big deep pit, right? So we help that wording, that framing, and so on, which also leads into assessment and measurement, because we know that what they're doing is effective, but we don't necessarily know how effective and how long those effects work. So we are developing more monitoring and evaluation indicators, which Joan will get into a little bit later. And so all of this is helping to strengthen the structure and the process and procedures of the organizations with whom we're working.
So just want to add something that you made me think about, Beth. And of course, our work is for the most part with youth. And during the summer, this past summer, we did a summer internship research that allow us to research on youth as a particular stage of life. And thus we started to conceive, because of all of the challenges that we have seen on the ground, especially about sustainability, etc., that of course youth is conceived as a transitory stage. And thus anything that we think about in terms of opening space for youth, etc., should consider that, right? We cannot be adult-centric or child-centric when we look at youth, and this is important. And so we advanced some research that is then being incorporated into our approach to better understand then solutions or transformations that include youth. So that's important.
Yeah, I'd forgotten about that. That was really a great addition and sort of a little bit of an eye-opener to us to understand that it is transitory, and that's okay that it's transitory. And so because it's transitory, they age out of certain initiatives. So yeah, thank you for that.
And so we have been developing a tool, a method to monitor and evaluate processes of social transformation. And we have taken an approach very much based on CMM that seeks to understand transformation and to collect that data that is qualitative, right? And we have been working with an organization, a foundation here in Colombia, Fundación Pintuco, that has worked with different populations, among them youth populations, graffiti artists for the most part, that work in their communities. And 2 years ago, we spoke with the director of this foundation, and one of the challenges that he mentioned was that there isn't enough data to be able to see how is it that transformation takes place, not in numbers, but in stories, etc. And so we engaged in a monitoring and evaluation process with Fundación Pintuco, and we're seeing how is it that art, that the material painting, etc., has an impact on people's life, on the life of communities, but we are doing this through, of course, a narrative analysis and stories. So here are just two pictures. The one in the left is in Comuna 13. This one is in a place where Sombata had, before the pandemic, their offices, or where they train, where they practice, etc. And then on the right, there is a DAISY model that we constructed with some people in an area where Pintuco had done some work. So the monitoring and evaluation tool that we are in a process of developing is participatory, and it draws from PAR, or participatory action research. And the reason why we sort of lean towards PAR is because we believe that monitoring and evaluation should not be done just in an observation kind of dynamic, but people who are actually experiencing the effects of initiative should also take part in the monitoring and evaluation. Right? So how is it that people are experiencing the effects of initiatives, right? So in doing this research, then we developed this measure of evaluation based on some of the principles of PAR, which are, of course, cooperation, experience, logic, and empirical evidence. And one of the questions we ask, one of the questions that is raised in PAR is how do you immerse yourself, how do you immerse research in the social life without abandoning the obligations of science? Right? There is some rigor in science that should not be abandoned, but there's also some rigor in the everyday life that should be included when we look at these things. And so we published recently, actually, an article called Transforming Conflict Narratives, in which we take the life history of two people with whom we have worked and identified some critical moments that allow them to make decisions that would then have an effect not only on them, positive, if you will, decisions that have an effect on their personal life, but also in the life of their community. And we identified those critical moments through using the CMM methodology, but also involving actively those people that we were interviewing. So allowing them to actually identify these critical moments and then speaking about the reasons why these critical moments were taken in a specific way, and then the effects that had in their personal life and the effect that had in the social life of the community, right? So CMM and storytelling and testimonies are central to the way we come up with indicators, for example, for a monitoring and evaluation project. It centers narratives held by individuals, right? So what we want to measure is the way narratives, the way you tell about, the way you tell your own story, the way you understand your own story to others. We want to measure that. And as I said before, the transformations are identified with, and this is important, with the interviewees, the persons that we are working with, not in a lab, perhaps, at ColumbiaUniversity, but by us.
Yeah, I wanted to say a little bit about CMM because we put it out there. So CMM is an abbreviation for Coordinated Management of Meaning, which is a very practical theory. And it really does look at how we socially construct our worlds. And so if we're looking at it from a conflict perspective, I'd like to think that if we are part of creating the conflict, then that means we can also be part of remedying or the solution to resolving the conflict. And when we look at the use of CMM this way in storytelling and narratives, there are different tools and concepts and practices inside of CMM that allows us to capture some of these shifts in perspective taking. So when you're doing qualitative research and you're looking at narrative transformation, this is something we've been very fixated on for a while, and we're continuing to hone what we understand there, because it's very challenging to really pinpoint and identify what is different. So it doesn't mean that your narrative completely transforms. It means that there are ways you talk about certain things at certain times that change. And so what happens then is there is a relationship with the language we use in our brains and all of that, the neurosciences, has a connection then which manifests itself in our behavior and our actions, okay? So when somebody does some kind of an action, we have a response to that reaction. When you're transforming your narrative, it means that you're understanding that action differently and how it connects to you, which means your participation in that interaction with that person now shifts as well. And it's sort of like if you're not giving oxygen to a flame, the flame is going to peter out, right? So if you're not fueling a disagreement, or if you're not acting to fuel a conflict, eventually that conflict is going to peter out, go someplace else. It's going to shift the dynamic in your relationship. And so it's really interesting also how we share this with the partners that we're working with, and we co-discover these transformations together, because it gives them a little bit of insight into themselves and also insights into the work they're doing with others and how to continue to finesse and fine tune that approach. So it isn't something that, like I said, we do research on. No, we do research with, and we really try as much as we can to embody that approach. And if we're not, we hope we get called out on it, because that really is our MO and how we operate in the field. Something else I wanted to mention is two other kinds of theoretical approaches as an example of how we use theory in the field. And this one other one is called dynamical systems. And what we're doing, while CMM also has a systems approach because we understand the context that we're in and we understand the way we talk and narrative in the context that we are in, dynamical systems also helps us to understand what are the different dynamics that are happening in any kind of field. And so we work with people, with the groups we're working with, we process the data with them, and even tomorrow and over the weekend, we're going to be having workshops really looking at, here are the different elements in your environment. Let's look at the ones that are positively contributing to the situation here. For example, one of the research projects we're working on is defining security. What does security mean to the residents of a particular area in Columbia 13? Because otherwise we can just go in and take actions to provide more security, but we may miss the mark because we may not really understand what does security mean. And it doesn't mean that security has the same definition for all of the different groups. So we're working with them and we're going to look at the different elements and see what contributes to increasing a sense of security, what contributes to decreasing that sense of security and maybe fostering insecurity, and what are the relationships amongst them. And the reason this is important is because when you intervene in any kind of a system, you're upsetting the system to some degree, which means you're going to have some kind of manifestation somewhere else. We can call these unintended consequences, which sometimes happen because we weren't anticipating a certain kind of reaction, for better or worse. We can also be developing what we would call a latent attractor. It means that we are continuing to give input into the system, but we're not seeing it manifest yet. And then one day, boom, it looks like all of a sudden. When it's not all of a sudden, it's been building momentum towards that. So working with our partners on the ground, we're providing extra tools, extra concepts for them to understand their own work and their own environment so they can be more effective. Another example, one more example, I mean, there are many theories, but one more example of a theory that sort of came up for me when we were just talking today is the whole idea about intergroup dynamics. When you perceive that another group is taking the resources that you think you need and you deserve, there can be a source of conflict. So how do you understand the whole mental idea about a scarcity of resources? Is there really a scarcity, or are there other ways of thinking about the resources? Are there ways of fostering collaboration so that we can all share in the resources? And these are some of the concepts that we introduce, not necessarily in academic technical terms. If people ask, we're happy to explain it that way. But we want to then, and I think our responsibility is to translate the theory into what makes sense on the ground, and how can we really capture real situations and understand it through the lens of theory to deepen the understanding and then the action that people can take from that.
Indeed, and in that sense, then the stories are also part, I mean, they're an integral part of the data that we need then to be able to measure, evaluate, and see what takes place on the ground, right? Not only the indicators that sometimes come from governments that are numerical, completely quantitative, but the stories then allow us to sort of glue together these numbers and make better sense of them together. And something important then is that through stories that emerge in the work we do with our colleagues, then there is also a sense of, quote, empowerment, if you will, because then people start understanding that through their stories, they can identify the moments in which they have acted and transformed their social conditions, right? These things are not easily captured in numbers. These transformations, their participation in these transformations are captured better in stories, and thus the importance of this.
Just one more thing. I think when you were talking about that, I'm thinking about some of the recent conversations I've been part of. When you look at data and you look at information, and when does data transform into becoming information? And you mentioned the quantitative data, and that the stories enhance and give meaning to the quantitative data. So all of it is data, but how do you really understand it so that it informs what you're doing? So that's an interesting concept too.
Okay, and lastly, here it's just a picture of a workshop we did at Casa Colacho in Comuna 2013, precisely one of the collectives that has really had an influence in 2013 after different kinds of or waves of violence, and with whom we are thinking together a way to integrate CMM into their own methodology, also thinking a way of measuring the historical impact of this organization in their community.
And one of the things that's really unique about this particular organization is their whole orientation towards social entrepreneurship. Very innovative, very clever, very business oriented in that sense, to say, you know what, we cannot only depend on municipal funding or on grants and proposals, but we need to think about going to the self-empowerment and the self-sufficiency. What are some of the initiatives we can do naturally that is just an extension of what we're already doing that can actually bring in revenues and increase that sense of entrepreneurship?
Yeah, and those things are only captured then in the stories. If you look at peace building or peace indicators from the national government, it's hard to identify initiatives such as this one.
Great.
So this finalizes.
Yeah, so this is the part we want to present, and now we look forward to any questions or comments, sort of Q&A box. So part of what we're doing now on the ground is continuing to work with organizations. Most of the organizations we do work with use the arts to transform. It's something that seems to come naturally for them. So we're really excited about that. And really, like I said, strengthening what they're doing. And there's always an opportunity to meet new people and new organizations. And the other thing we're doing, which we didn't mention, was that we do work with other universities down here from time to time. And so we have an ongoing project with one university right now, with Bebe, and we're going to be meeting with another university in Bogota that hopefully we can do something with in the summer. Okay, do you want to read that?
So can you give some practical examples of what you did? A good story, perhaps. Something that comes to mind, especially in the usage of academic principles, perhaps, on the ground, it's working with a colleague, I won't mention his name, in Medellín. We transferred some of the principles of CMM with them. And then he started working in one organization in Medellín that wanted to sort of depict the way a group of people from a neighborhood were displaced from their original homes, and then the way they resettled and the way they constructed this community. He was going to work with a group of graffiti artists in order to construct a concept that would encapsulate the story of these community members. And the way that he did it was through using CMM. So he did, along with the community members and the graffiti artists, CMM workshops using the DAISY model, the timeline, and other principles to capture the stories first from the community members, and then to make and to process them and to make better sense of them with the graffiti artists that then would end up in the concept of an artistic piece that would then be placed at the Museum of Memory, House of Memory in Medellín. And years later, Beth and I went, he invited us to see this mural, this gigantic mural right in front of this museum that was the result, of course, of the work of these people utilizing their own tools, but also the implication of CMM in capturing and making itself practical, useful, etc., for something of this to happen.
One of the things that was so remarkable about that is this is probably about a 1 to 2 year process that you went through, and we had no idea that it was taking place. And so we were, I'll speak with myself, emotionally overwhelmed at what happened, because it was all around the theme of reconciliation and how we utilized something we introduced and just took it to a whole new level about how we integrated community members and graffiti artists was really very special. The other example I was going to give is something that actually also evolves a theory, right? So CMM, as I mentioned, is a practical theory. And one of the tools is the Serpentine Model, where we also use it as a timeline. And excuse me, we have been using it to understand the series of events that happen over a period of time. And you can define any period of time that you can call an episode. for the people's personal story and their social story, because we wanted to highlight how we don't develop who we are in isolation from our context, from our social environment. And our social environment doesn't develop without input from the people in that environment. So there's an interplay. And so, for example, there was a period in time when there was a very big influx of migration into Medellín. And we worked with a couple of youth leaders who discovered through this process that they came to Medellín around the same time at around the same age. And during the course of doing this, I'm now working with organizations and not only individuals, we realized, well, there's another timeline. There's the timeline of the stories of the organization, which now interplays with the personal and social. So now we have 3 timelines all coming together with an interplay, which is just phenomenal, which we will write about at some point in time. But then it shows how not only do people personally respond to the social environments, but the organization also responds to the social environment, and that then has an impact on people. So there's just this really beautiful integration across.
And I think we can connect this a little bit to what Sammy asked about the usage of both quantitative and qualitative data in tandem almost. So the question is, what type of quantitative research methods you used, and then was the data numbers in tandem with the stories told by community members and youth activists, and some examples. So for example, in one of those timelines that you were talking about, you can identify easily, let's say, a number of new migrants or new settlers in a particular community in a particular time. That gives you a rough number, right? That the quantitative aspect. But then in that timeline, and because you're doing that with people, you sort of open up a space so that one of those stories comes out, right? And then through that story, you understand better that, let's say, 30, the number 30, which were the new settlers in a specific space, right? And this is, if one of the people of those 30 are in there, you better understand what does it mean to be a number within those 30, right? And this is something, of course, that hasn't been studied in depth yet. We are in the process of developing a tool that captures this in the most practical way, and that makes sense.
So I'm going to give a specific example about that. When we were with one of the groups doing a workshop with them, with community members, trying to gather from this particular group of community members, what does security mean to them? They talked about the big influx. So, okay, if you think about it for a minute, if there's a big influx, right, you have suddenly a larger population of people coming into a very finite area. What does that mean, right? Where are they going to go? What does it mean in terms of housing? What does it mean in terms of school, employment, municipal services, which there weren't any at the time because it was a territory. It wasn't really part of the official city. And then somebody there said, well, we collectively got together and started building. We started collecting bricks and we started working together to build houses for each other. And then you say, wow, now you have this layer of humanity onto the numbers, because the numbers don't tell the full story. But now hearing from a person about how they got together to put a roof over their head, because originally they had the corrugated tin, right, or plastic, whatever they could just to make a shelter. And they realized that they weren't going anywhere else. They were staying where they were. So they needed to have a little bit more permanent housing. And so now they started to build houses together. So now you also figure out, okay, there's a new sense of community developing, because people didn't all migrate en masse together from the same place. They came from all different places. So now they're all in the same situation. And that could go any way, right? It can go into complete violence where they're fighting with each other for those same scarce resources, or they could join together and build. And so I'm not saying everything was rosy all the time, but there was an effort to come together and co-construct their community, because they realized we are here and we're going to make a community together.
And adding to that, I mean, we are sort of action-oriented, right? And the way we think about monitoring and evaluation is action-oriented. It's not only to obtain data, read data, and understand data, but what do we do with this data? And so an example of something happening here in Colombia and in other places of the world is this conception of, and they have a name for that here in Colombia, it's NENI. So these are youth that do not work, nor do they study. And when you read statistics, etc., you have an X number of NENIs. And if you only read that, what you will come up with is this youth they don't do anything. Now, if you take one example, if you sort of zoom in into these statistics, into these NENIs, and start asking questions, interviewing the people that are part of these statistics, you then understand what is it that they are doing. It isn't that they're not doing anything. They are doing other things, and from those other things that they are doing, that are not studying or working, then you can also start thinking with them about possible interventions, possible actions to take with them to integrate them into the national economy, into the participation, into the political participation, etc.
Yeah, very interesting. So just because people don't show up in certain places doesn't mean they're not doing anything, which is an interesting lesson there.
So a key question, but have you tried to embed these times in story map? So it's a visually compelling and might be something that you could train folks to do.
Yeah, I think that the use of visual aids is always a good thing to do, especially what we do when we work with communities, as you see from our pictures, is we do low tech because of the accessibility of internet, accessibility of computers, and so on. And there's something about a visceral touching of a Post-it. I have to really give a lot of kudos to people who invented Post-its. That the idea of a Post-it is really an interesting thing. Now, when we're at university, we do use some tools where there's a collaborative tool where people can construct maps together and make their own Post-its online. And there's something low tech about that. And we have used software to transfer some of that low tech, but I think that we could consider, depending on who we're working with and what the accessibility to the internet and tech is, we could also translate it with people and do that as well. But the interactivity that happens is really what we're looking for, right? So we're looking for collaboration, and it happens with low tech, high tech, a variety of tools. So for example, in many times when we're working with different groups, people individually write up different Post-its and they put them up there, and then organically they get together and they're discussing the Post-its. They're building on each other's stories. They're looking for the similarities and differences, and they're moving the Post-its. That's the low-tech version. It also, I've seen it happen in the high-tech version. We've used Miro and other kinds of things where people create these Post-its and then they move them around and try to make the story reflect, the visual of the story reflect the story that they're actually telling. And it's not only the finished product, but it's the process of getting to the finished product that's so rich, and that's where so much discovery happens. And it's an opportunity to really go back and reflect on those conversations and see, because sometimes people change their thinking a little bit. They say, oh, I didn't realize that, or what do you mean by that? They probe, and here's where conflict resolution communication skills come in too. It's not like, no, that's not what happened, which of course could be what somebody says. And it's also like, okay, let's shift how we say that. That may not have been your experience. Let's acknowledge and honor that it might have been that person's experience. The goal is to understand. So tell me more about what your experience was in that, and tell me more about how you say that. Like for me, it's always interesting to look at the wording that people use. Why is it that they said it that way? And here's where you see the narrative transformation as well. And sometimes this narrative transformation happens right in the workshop that we're doing, right? It's not only a story somebody tells us afterwards, but it's a shift. They go, wow, I hadn't realized that. Or people have an aha moment, and you sort of strive for those aha moments in the workshops.
And I mean, reality is never finished, apparently. It's always in a state of flux. And some technology, I mean, Post-its are great. And some technology, so we have used this Miro thing with Casa Collage precisely to engage in a timeline that has this third dimension that you were talking about, including not only the personal, the social, but Casa Collage itself. And what we have been seeing is that, so we left the timeline online open as a living document. And what we have been seeing is that it continues to transform itself. So those maps just like physical maps, countries change boundaries all the time. People's sort of mental maps and collective maps also change. And so these tools are helpful to sort of capture these changes.
Yeah, when you're talking about the transformation, so the communities don't stay the same either. The communities continue to change, and that means that if the organizations want to remain relevant in that community, they have to continually develop themselves and be attuned to what's happening in the community. And so that means they have to have multiple levels of awareness and transformation and adaptation, right? So one would be on the personal level and themselves as instrument, and I think that when people feel that they're no longer relevant in a certain situation, they should transition out and open up the space for other people. It doesn't always happen. Sometimes people overstay their welcome and stay beyond their effectiveness. But I have to say that also in our work, when we talk about youth leaders, we've met so many people who are well up into middle age who were youth leaders back in the 1990s, 1980s, 1990s, and continue to work in the community. So they were youth leaders and they've transitioned into different kinds of community leaders, and they continue to transition and add value and develop others. And we have ongoing conversations with a lot of these different people. And as part of our ongoing work as well, is that we're going to be capturing some of these stories as well, because we want to understand the transition that people have happened. And we want to understand the need and in the communities. So from the 1970s, 80s, 90s through now, the past 50 years, we really want to understand what was happening in Colombia. So we've centered a lot of our work in Medellín, and now we're going to be expanding also through other cities and other rural areas as well, because we realize that a lot of what we learned here could be applied in other places as well. And a lot of the youth leaders that we're working with also go to other places like Cali and Choco and other places there too.
OGs indeed, Ted, these people that Beth is talking about. And if we want to use this zoom in, zoom out metaphor again, being able to understand what's taking place today among youth leaders, that's sort of the zoom in aspect, and then you zoom out and see historically what has happened to youth and what have youth done to respond to conflicts in different times is what we are also trying to understand now. So what were the youth responding to in the 80s, in the 90s, in the beginning of the 2000s, etc., and also seeing some of the trajectories of tools being sort of transferred from one generation to another.
Yeah, and I think two other points I wanted to make now too about transitions, right? So one thing is, if we say that, a lot of the organizations we work with are using the arts, this is why being here on the ground, you can be at an intersection and there are houses, and in that intersection, you hear different music coming from all four corners because it's just blasting out. Music is such a part of the environment here. Not all neighborhoods, but many neighborhoods that we've been to. The other development that's happened more recently and is still in its sort of formation right now is the whole idea about sustainability in terms of the environment, the natural environment. Is we notice in the past couple of years, groups are also organizing themselves around roof gardens and greenery and growing vegetables and different kinds of herbs and things like that, and beautifying, and then thinking about what to do with waste, how do you sustain the environment, climate control, climate change, cleanup, and all of that. And they're really starting to pay attention to that. And it's a really great opportunity, going back to also thinking about the social entrepreneurship aspect. If we're working with groups now, and if the groups themselves are also thinking about developing youth, and it's an interesting thing too, that youth leaders are very focused on younger children in their environments. They want them to grow up better than they did generationally, right? So what are some of the things they can do working with the younger children as they come up in terms of employment and social entrepreneurship going forward? And probably the green environment, working in sustainability and the natural environment, is definitely a trajectory that's emerged more recently than I think was around earlier on.
No, absolutely. And also part of the stories of these youth that live here in Medellín, who come from rural areas. right? So also how to engage and sort of relate to the environment in a way that is connected in some ways to their past experiences, but also in a way that sort of inhibits the climate change that we have seen all over the world.
The other thing I wanted to mention was just going back to the quantitative and qualitative data, which goes back to, like, you don't need to do all the data collection yourself. You don't have to have firsthand data collection. You can use existing resources of data, which is what we use. So if there are statistics on violence or gun violence or gang violence or numbers of youth, demographic shifts, and so on, we can understand that. We don't have to do that work ourselves. We can use the data. Of course, you have to always consider the source of the data and how it was collected, because that's important. We can use existing sources of data to then work and interpret with our own lenses and the qualitative aspects. So that's another important thing that I know sometimes students in the NECR program want to always do the firsthand data collection themselves, and sometimes they can or can't because of multiple limitations. There are many good sources of data out there in the world where other people, governments and so on, census takers and so on, are gathering that data that can definitely be used for our purposes. So that's something that we should always consider using.
Yeah, looking at this quote, Ted, that you shared with everyone here, it speaks about the imagination, right? So we in a book wrote about a method, an approach. We can speak about an approach, a method, but there is something that is sort of non-tangible, something almost magical perhaps, that takes place in the process of doing peace building, social transformation, that has to do with the imagination, almost with giving birth to something that didn't exist before. And thus creativity has to be factored in the approach, right? You can use CMM that has a specific way of being utilized, BST, PAR, etc. But there has to be space for intuition, creativity, dreaming, etc. That is always present both in grassroots organizations, but even if you speak to governmental officials that work on things relating to peace building, they also claim that sometimes in the moment, in the place, you have an intuition and you have to sort of let it out in order for everything to sort of be placed together and make sense.
Yeah, so that's what I live by, the state of mind, because as my chronological age goes up, my state of mind stays very youthful. But when I think about what does that mean? It means that remaining curious, being a lifelong learner, and these are the things that you can develop in others, right? So that's part of what an education should be. It's not only knowing content, but it's knowing how to know. It's learning how to learn, right? And so being an observer of life, being an observer of people, circumstances, and so on means that you're always trying to stay attuned to what's going on. And I know for me, who now I consider myself a scholar practitioner, but started out a much stronger practitioner, and my scholarship has gotten stronger over the years, I still have my instinct is I learned something from research or theory or whatever it is. And my first reaction is, how can I use that? How can I use that in the work? How can I use that in the field? How can I share that? Because it's as an educator and also as a practitioner in the field, it's always, how can I use it? How can I share it? How can other people benefit from it? So if we can continue to inspire others to want to be lifelong learners and continue to be curious, I think then that's most of the challenge, what we have to do. Because once you think you know it all and you stop being aware and you stop being curious and you stop learning, you just stop. Are you going to add something else?
Well, just something, a brief story about this space of imagination, this space of continued learning, this space just for randomness almost, or the unknown. We were told of a story of two negotiators once in a very violent conflict in one area of Medellín. These are organic mediators. I'll tell like the story of Augusto in Convidarte. And I won't tell the whole thing to not bore anyone, but they sat down with one of the leaders of a gang that was in the center of this conflict It seemed like the negotiators wanted two gangs to do a ceasefire, to stop fighting for at least 1 weekend so that they could do a community party in this neighborhood. The negotiation was a little rough. They had almost a script. They knew what they were going to ask of this gang leader. And at a moment, this person, the gang leader, receives a phone call from an ex-girlfriend. Apparently, she told him something that made his heart, his mind, enter in a different stage, in a different level, and he agreed then to the ceasefire. So it didn't matter what these two mediators had in their script, their methods, what they had planned. This was this instant in which the human comes in, the mind, the heart, the spirit connects, and this is also very, very important in negotiation. So with that story.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. It's that pivotal point of paying attention to the environment and the context, because that woman, when she called up, was able to shift the disposition and the perspective taking of that person. So they needed to get off script and get attuned to what was happening in the room, which is what good negotiators and mediators do, right? They pay attention to what's going on and they read the signals and they read the signs very much. So I think that's probably it for us today. So thank you for joining us. And for those of you who will listen to this at another time, and we're actually now going to go and start to work with another group that we've been working with. Thank you so much.
Thank you.